Well, I'm joined now from Hungerford by the historian and author Sir Max Hastings, and here in the studio by Maria Misra, who specialises in studying Britain's colonial history. Max Hastings, why is this state masochism?
That report that we've just seen on Channel 4 News did seem extraordinarily one-sided, that many people don't think that the IRA was a very attractive organisation, but I don't think the IRA was ever prone in cold blood to chop babies in half, as Mau Mau routinely did. 2,500 Kenyans were murdered by Mau Mau, whereas a mere 100 white settlers and members of the security forces. So first of all, Mau Mau was a very unpleasant organisation. Secondly, while there's absolutely no doubt that serious maltreatment of people held in detention by the British government did take place, all these numbers being bandied around are being pulled out of the air. There is no exact evidence. It's not a attempt to deny it. I'm merely asking the question. I was one of those who was very opposed to war crimes trials of people who committed war crimes in the Second World War, continuing after a certain span, because I don't think you can have justice after 60 years on the basis of oral evidence. I think a lot of this oral evidence is wildly unreliable. Can you think of any other nation in the world that would have done this?
Maria Misra is here in the studio. Well, can you think of any other nation that would have done this? And what's the value of it? Well,
I think, first of all, the British make a big deal about forcing the Japanese at every possible opportunity to apologise for their colonial crimes. I think a lot of what Max has said is extremely disingenuous. I mean, this is not just based on oral evidence. This is based on an enormous hidden colonial archive that the lawyers for these Kenyans forced the British to divulge. I'm afraid the numbers who were killed vary. Estimates vary between 130,000 and 300,000 people. That is the demographic deficit that Kenya suffered at the end of the Mau Mau. In terms of whether it's a good thing for Britain, of course it's a good thing for Britain. I'm afraid it's the attitude of people like Max who bring Britain into disrepute, and I absolutely applaud William Hague for what he's done. OK, Max Hastings?
I'm afraid we've got into a world in which the judges have lost sight of common sense. William Hague had to do what he did, because although the Foreign Office strove to make a case that you couldn't have realistic judicial proceedings at this stage, a judge ruled differently. There has been a lot of emotional pressure. The government had to give way. I repeat, I cannot imagine, although many terrible things were done in the colonial era, after 60 years, I can imagine no other nation in the world that would have paid out £20 million of taxpayers' money on what I persist in saying is still overwhelmingly oral evidence.
Maria Misra, why should today's taxpayers, especially in today's climate, pay anything for something that happened generations ago under a colonial administration for which no current politician or person has any responsibility?
First of all, it isn't that many generations ago. Secondly, it is a clear injustice for which there is a lot of documentary, not merely oral evidence. And secondly, it's in Britain's interests to do it. It is in Britain's interests to do it. There's a lot of speculation that there was pressure from America. The British Foreign Office fought this case tooth and nail until May, and then they dropped it and they agreed to settle. And the reason they agreed to settle is they don't want all of this dragged out in open court. I think they'd rather leave it to the historians and let the bad news come out over time.
And what do you say to Sir Max Hastings' question about what about the Mau Mau? Would you pursue them too?
Well, the Mau Mau, of course, were a nationalist organisation. All nationalist organisations are divided. All anti-colonial movements are divided. They're not made up of saints. But to disparage them in this way, to talk about them killing babies, eating babies, I mean, this is silly World War I propaganda of the most ludicrous variety. Nobody would deny that the Mau Mau was divided amongst themselves and that they committed violence against other Africans. But nevertheless, every historian, serious historian who does work on this, agrees that this was a bona fide anti-colonial freedom movement.
Are you a serious historian, Sir Max Hastings?
In colonial history. This was one of the most brutal colonial organisations. What chance would descendants of the victims of Mau Mau have in a Nairobi court of claiming compensation against Mau Mau? Not much, I think.
All right, let me just come to the question of precedent. Who else might want to go after the British government, Maria Misra?
Well, I mean, I think that, as I say, this huge archive has come out, this hidden archive, which it's clear that British colonial authorities connived in hiding from the 50s onwards. And then in the 1980s, under the Thatcher governments, agreed to suppress all of this material again. Nearly 10,000 documents are coming out relating to 37 colonial societies.
Give us some examples, briefly.
I suspect the big ones will be aid in Yemen, Cyprus and the Cypriot crisis, possibly more in Africa, but Botswana, the Chagos Islands and the formation of Diego Garcia Base. There's a lot of evidence already that there were cover-ups here of maltreatment.
So, Max Hastings, I mean, aren't we finally getting a little closer to the truth about empire and what it did and what it represented?
There is absolutely no doubt. One thing I would have to totally agree about is that any suggestion that where the British won colonial struggles, that they won by winning hearts and minds, is not true. There's no dispute about the fact that there was brutality, sometimes on a very large scale, that the colonial authorities sometimes behaved very badly indeed, and yes, there was a systematic cover-up. But my argument is based on the notion after 60 years, I do think it's right to leave this to the historians and not to the judiciary. And I say to treat Mau Mau, as I just heard Maria describe it, as a bona fide nationalist organisation. The atrocities of which Mau Mau were guilty were far more grievous than anything the British colonial authorities did. And the statistics you produce are ludicrous.
On that note of discord, we'll have to leave it. So Max Hastings, Maria Misra, thank you very much indeed.